are doing in this country?
Yeah, it's perhaps worth... So first of all, just slightly apologising for my voice. I'm recovering from a cold.
No problem.
It's perhaps worth pointing out I am representing the Federation of Small Businesses, but like all policy leads in the FSB, I'm actually a lay member, and my regular job is running a small business. So I run a research-intensive research institute based in Teesside that develops in technology primarily for the steel and metal sector. That's kind of what I do day to day. With FSB colleagues, particularly those involved in the innovation field, we were unsurprised and relieved, I would say, by the revision of the ONS data, because we'd also found puzzling the difference between the ONS and HMRC data. And this was something we discussed over the summer, in that it didn't tally with our anecdotal understanding of the sector. And as a scientist and an engineer, it's never good to be in a position where I feel that the hard data doesn't tally with what we sense by anecdote. So yes, we do think that the statistics are in a much better place now in correlating. And I think when you look at international comparisons between tax data and survey data, certainly our gap was the wrong way around. And so we do look more in line internationally as well. I think it is interesting to think why we've ended up in this position. So the ONS have been using a methodology that they've deployed since the 1980s, and for much of that time with reasonable success. But ultimately it relied on an implicit understanding that there was a correlation between business size and innovation intensity or innovation capability, which maybe that did hold true in the 1980s, but it's not the case now. And actually, I think there is something there that we need to address in our assumptions as well. And I think this did come through in the autumn statement, in the changes that were proposed around R&D tax credits. That I do sense in HMRC there is an assumption that innovation is something that's done in big businesses, when in reality it's something that's also done very much in small businesses. In fact, in the life sciences sector, we've seen a big shift over many years in the business model there. To allowing innovation to flourish in small businesses and promote entrepreneurial activity in that way. And in fact, in the Federation of Small Businesses, our members report to us that the entrepreneurs' business plans are very much assisted by R&D tax credits, and that if the R&D tax credits weren't there, then there are some businesses that wouldn't go ahead. They just simply wouldn't start.
Do you recognise also the sectoral issues? That I don't know if you were listening to the section with Mr. Morgan, not sure when you arrived, but I mean, your company and the life science company, those are sort of classic R&D, sort of relatively intensive industries, but it seems that some businesses were doing things that are R&D and just weren't being captured. Do you recognise that with your FSB hat on?
Yes, so there are small businesses that are doing R&D, and they're not captured either by the survey or by the HMRC data, actually. So I mean, so ONS said themselves, I think in the blog that was referred to just earlier, that there are a number of R&D intensive small businesses that it's spotted in the HMRC data that have never been subject to the ONS survey, and I think that was one of the triggers that caused ONS to look at this in more detail. But it is also the case that there are a number of small businesses that don't engage with the R&D tax credits either. And again, when we talk to small businesses about that, some businesses are concerned about their relationship with HMRC. They see HMRC is quite a scary organisation, and maybe they don't want to engage with it. Some businesses simply don't know about it. Some businesses find the R&D tax credits system complex, and they are unwilling or unable to engage with a third party. So there are issues, I think, about accessibility to R&D tax credits, just as there have been issues around picking up those R&D intensive small businesses in the ONS data.
As we said towards the end of the first session, one of the implications of the revisions that the ONS have made is that actually our productivity problem looks even worse. And commentators have long pointed to small businesses, the long tail of companies that are not particularly productive or growth orientated or doing much research as part of the productivity puzzle. Do you think that's a fair criticism in general, and do you recognise that these figures actually make that add some more validity to that criticism? So
I think I don't know if you're referring to it, but Andy Haldane did a very good piece of work around that, where he showed that within place and with sector there was this quite long tail, and it is one of the things we've looked at from a Federation of Small Businesses perspective. And there was some discussion just towards the end of the evidence session there about the Frascati definition of R&D, and you were asking the question, Chair, about how comparable we are with other countries, but I think you also heard that there's some room for manoeuvre. And in fact, the UK's definition of R&D for access to the R&D tax credit scheme is somewhat tighter than in many other OECD countries, and quite particularly new to firm innovation, as we've styled it within the Federation of Small Businesses, is not included in that. And I think we need to give some consideration here to why why we have such policies at all. Surely the purpose of them is to promote economic growth and productivity growth, and yet we're excluding the most important thing that a business can do immediately, which is to do some new to firm innovation to increase its productivity and its innovation capability, because we have more of a focus perhaps on what might be termed good science than innovation that's actually creating economic benefit. So I have long argued, the Federation of Small Businesses and we published a report on this, Spotlight on Innovation, a couple of years ago, that actually it would be helpful to widen the definition so that it comes into line with OECD standards, so that it includes new to firm innovation as well. And that's one thing that we can do that will really help to pick up that long tail.
Thank you. Mr. Westlake, you've said that the, quote, jury is still out on what the reported rise in figures represent, particularly amongst small businesses. What's your view about the way they're using tax credits? Are the tax credits capturing genuine R&D? Are businesses that are doing genuine R&D not doing tax credits? What's your overall take on, particularly with regard to this long tail in the small business world?
So we know HMRC say about 7% of tax credits are basically from fraud and error. The question is that an underestimate, particularly when we're dealing with smaller businesses, because we know these are very aggressively marketed schemes. I think it's interesting if we look at other countries and their use of tax credits. France is probably the main OECD country that uses tax credits on the same level that the UK does, about 0.3% of GDP going on those. Places like the US, Korea, very innovative countries, spend about a third relative to the size of the economy on tax credits that we do. And places like Germany and Israel spend nothing on them. They don't have an R&D tax credit scheme at all. So it's definitely not a necessary component of a successful, innovative country. Clearly, though, it is popular, and it is a way of accessing, as we've seen, businesses that aren't interacting with, say, Innovate UK or the grant-making bodies. So it's a valuable initiative. I think the point that Chris makes about creating clear definitions is really important as well. And one thing that we saw happen about 15 years ago in the life sciences industry is the life science industry, who are very good at this kind of organisation, set out lots of guidance working with HMRC to say, this is what it looks like to do R&D in biotech in the life sciences industry. And that made it a lot easier for these firms, which, as Chris says, a lot of them are quite small firms. They can't employ lots of professionals to advise them on this, to work out what to claim. And I think that level of more specificity, more sort of saying, well, this is what R&D really looks like, might help more firms to take advantage of the credits that they're entitled to. That would be very helpful.
Thank you. And going to this whole overall productivity puzzle problem and the implication that we're even less productive than we thought, do you think we need to to what extent do we need to rethink the relationship between R&D and productivity, and more specifically our exploitation of innovation? Because it looks like we're doing quite a lot of innovation in this country, but yet somehow it's not coming through into the figures. Is this a statistical artifact, or is there something else going on here?
Well, we know that there's lots of different things that contribute to productivity, so it's not just R&D and innovation, but infrastructure and skills, finance, all these other things. So the fact that we're lagging, even though we're doing a little better at innovation, doesn't necessarily mean that there's a problem with wanting to do more on innovation. It might be that actually we need to really take advantage of becoming a science superpower and doing that. And in one sense, there's something quite optimistic for that message to take away from these stats, which is that what it shows is that if you want to think about it as leverage, the leverage between the money that government spends on R&D and the money that businesses spend, that ratio is much better than we thought now that these stats have been put out. So our previous worry had been we spend all this taxpayers' money on innovation, but we seem to get less private sector innovation as a result than, let's say, Germany did. And that made us think, well, is it really worth spending the money on this? But actually, the fact that that ratio, the leverage that we get from the public money we put in, is better, that suggests that actually this policy move is a move in the right direction.
Because finally, as I mentioned in the first panel, this committee's been going around the country taking evidence about the role of science and technology in the economic recovery from COVID. It's the implication of what you just said, perhaps that all this R&D is all very well and a good thing, but there are actually some other levers that need to be pulled more firmly. You mentioned infrastructure and skills particularly.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, getting productivity right, and I think this has been clear in all the government's writing on industrial strategy and productivity growth, you need to do multiple things. I think the question to answer is, do you want to just raise everything up to an average level, which is certainly one strategy, and then you sort of say, well, we're average on R&D, so let's take our foot off the gas there? Or do you actually want to say, let's work out what the UK can be distinctively good at? And I would argue that R&D innovation is something that we should be making the most of, being a real national strength. We should work on the other things, but we shouldn't quit now that we're in a good position on R&D.
Thank you very much indeed. Tracy Crouch.
You referenced the changes in the autumn statement to the SME tax credit scheme, that they were obviously largely due to HMRC concerns. To what extent would you agree with that assessment?
Well, I disagree with the assessment. I think that the policy would have made some sense back in the spring when it was initially sort of mooted, because at that time the ONS data hadn't been corrected and HMRC were looking for an explanation between the gap between the HMRC and the ONS data. But once the ONS data was corrected late September, early October, then that reasoning, that rationale fell away. And so then quite a lot of work was done by myself and others to try and point out to HMRC that there was then a flaw in the logic. However, perhaps the steamroller had started running and the proposal ran through to the budget. So I think now the changes as proposed to the R&D tax credit scheme are not on a foundation of solid evidence as a result of the massive change that we've heard about in the ONS data.
Were you comfortable around the sort of kind of communication of those comments, and are you content at the moment that the industry, SMEs obviously are aware of the challenges and all that it faces?
Well, I think one thing that we need to be aware of is that it is difficult to communicate with the UK's extensive number of small businesses, and it takes quite a long time for messages to filter through. So we're still finding new businesses, small businesses, to work with who haven't heard of the R&D tax credit scheme. And in fact, and one of the things that I think HMRC haven't been particularly clear about as well is what happens at the extensive margin. So essentially, each year, how many new businesses are being drawn into the scheme? Because what we've seen is that for larger businesses, they tend to use the R&D tax credit scheme year after year after year as they have large programs of R&D. I used to manage a large program of R&D in a big business on that basis. But small businesses may engage in an R&D project, they may use the R&D tax credit scheme, and then they might not need to do that for a year or so because they're commercialising a new product or whatever. And so the challenge that we constantly have is ensuring that small businesses are aware of the scheme so that they can engage in it. And a change like this will cause a problem because there'll be a flow through of businesses presuming that the scheme has been withdrawn, and then if we can get some correction to that, then we'll have to sort of go back in and communicate that again. So I would expect this sort of cycle in and of itself to have a detrimental impact on small business innovation.
Thank you, Tracy. And finally, Chris Clarkson.
Thank you. Well, just picking up on that theme, do you think any particular sectors will be more affected than others by the changes?
I think that's difficult to say, but I mean, what we do know is that 70% of R&D is done in manufacturing. So we would expect the biggest impact, I would have thought, on manufacturing and manufacturing supply chains. And perhaps actually also to come back to the point about the general lag of productivity, I think that there are clearly big issues with productivity in the UK, but I think we can't look away from the fact that as an economy, generally, we're structurally weak in manufacturing compared with our OECD competitors. So as much as we will try hard to improve productivity, and we need to do more innovation to do that, if we really want to achieve higher levels of productivity, then we also need to have policies in place that will support more manufacturing. Manufacturing is more productive than services. It pays high wages and services. It does most R&D. So actually, as well as doing innovation, we also need to find out how we can do policies that will create more manufacturing as well.
May I build on that just briefly? I think one plea that I would put out at this stage to government, to HMRC, to the Treasury, is to keep the data coming on the R&D tax credit. Until very recently, there was very little data made available on claims for R&D tax credits at all, which is in stark comparison to Innovate UK grants, where there's lots of information published. Recently, HMRC have been proposing getting rid of the statistical appendices that tell you into which sectors this money is going. So we will be even less well positioned to answer this question quite soon unless HMRC makes sure that they publish this information. So I agree it's a good question to ask, and it's important we have the data to know.
Yeah, well, I think we need that granular data if we're going to understand what the long-term impacts are. But staying with the innovation piece, obviously spin-outs from university is very important. We've got the innovation factory in my part of the world at Manchester University, does some amazing things. How do you think the changes will affect spin-outs from universities, and how will it affect the relationship between spin-outs and SMEs?
Well, so talking about kind of entrepreneurialism and startups in general, and the same impact will be felt by spin-outs from universities. The R&D tax credit is a crucial part of the business plan at that early stage. So there are businesses, for whom the make or break in being able to launch will be dependent on the level of R&D tax credit, because ultimately it's a way of sharing the risk. And Stian mentioned earlier the difference between different countries and their use of R&D tax credits versus grants. And I think the R&D tax credit is a great success story for the UK, because if you are an entrepreneur, if you're a startup or perhaps small and growing business, you are best placed to determine what innovation needs to be done in your business. You know precisely what your customers and markets require, and you will deliver on that. If you're reliant on grant funding, then perhaps Innovate UK ran a grant scheme 18 months ago. Perhaps they're going to run one in 18 months' time. That is no use to you now. So the UK is good at innovation. We know we're good at startups as well, but perhaps not as good as some others at scale-up and growth. And the R&D tax credit scheme, as I see it, is a vital part of keeping us at the forefront of innovation in that way.
Thank you. Anything you'd like to ask, Mr. Whitflake?
I mean, I think broadly, anything that reduces the funding, or the public funding that can go into these businesses, on the whole, you would expect there to be fewer companies arising. I think it's a harder question to say if it were a choice between spending money on increasing R&D tax credits or other schemes that might be useful to, say, university spin-outs. That's a harder call to make. But we know that the R&D tax credit scheme is a good scheme. We know that it works. So if the question is reduce the level or keep the level the same, then keep the level the same is the obvious choice.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Chris. And just finally, although, Mr. Westlake, you pointed out that the government has maintained its commitment to the overall target, and in any case, successive governments have wanted to go beyond the narrow 2.4% target. Nevertheless, this change to the definition has big implications for whether getting there, whether kind of leveraging private sector investment, whether there's a bigger job to be done in bigger businesses or smaller businesses. Mr. MacDonald referred to the fact that we have a lot of small businesses doing now a lot of research and development. What would you say the implications for future policy are in terms of where the efforts are directed, even if the quantum is not really in doubt?
I think in the old world, when we were relying on the old numbers, we thought that there was a particular deficiency on the part of innovation among smaller businesses, because there was this dark matter of small businesses that we weren't seeing. And we thought that there was specifically a problem around this idea of the leverage rate, the relationship between the amount of public money we were putting in and private money. Now, those two problems, to a certain extent, go away under the new figures. It shows that there's a lot of small businesses, a lot more small businesses than we thought, doing interesting innovation, and that a pound of public money generates more private investment than we thought. Now, I think what all of that means is that rather than trying to focus very specifically on a perceived small business problem or a perceived tech transfer problem, it actually means we should kind of go back to the broad palette of interventions. Some of that stuff is quite straightforward. That's continuing to increase funding, whether that's through tax credits or through UKRI or other public bodies, making sure that there's access to finance so that businesses can grow. In some ways, it makes our task simpler because it means that we don't have a sort of unusual and specific problem.
Do you think the changes to the tax credit system, and Mr. MacDonald commented on this, that were included in the autumn statement, that actually made things, as it were, better for bigger businesses relative to small businesses, I assume that policy thinking predated this change. Does it look odd in the context of the discovery now of the statistical change?
Yes, I don't really follow the logic of the change that's been made to the R&D tax credits. I think it's important to continue to bear down on fraud and error, and we know that there is some. If you Google R&D tax credits, the number of consultancies coming up is a sign that there's a lot of sharp commercial practice going on there. But it's not quite clear to me what the